Thank you very much. Well, apologies for the delay. We had quite an electric debate earlier, so if you wouldn't mind starting your presentation, then we'll do the same thing. We'll come to you with questions afterwards.
Well, if I can just kick off, Chairman, it's appropriate that you've asked for this to come before you at about this time. We did earlier this year, as the council, set up an empty homes steering group, which is primarily officers, but it does draw from right across the council. So we had got some work already prepared on that. And Ellen, of course, who's been with us for about a year, is a bit of an expert in this area. In addition to that, as a council, we have now started to look at the whole strategy of homes and housing in Breckland, and this is something that will probably come to you, but not for several months, so don't ask for that quite yet. But maybe in the spring or summer next year, we'll probably have some direction on that. But we are looking at every single part of housing and how we deal with it. So this is a good point to come in with empty homes. Ellen is the person who's been researching it, reading about, writing up, and been living it for decades, I think. And obviously, Jill, you know, because she's been to you before about housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Next slide, please. Yeah, so why are empty homes a problem? Obviously, nobody would want to live next to an empty home for several reasons, which I've put up here. They can be unsightly, a nuisance, a blight to neighbouring houses. If you've got a dilapidated empty home next to your house and you're trying to sell, you may not get the price you deserve for your house. If you feel like investing in your house, are you going to, if you know that you're going to put yourself in negative equity because you've got a house next door that's a blight? Antisocial behaviour, squatting, arson are all things that are attributed to empty homes because they're visible and they attract that type of behaviour. Next slide. The other reason for not keeping an empty home empty is to do with housing need. At the moment, we've got 1,333 households on the council's housing register and over 100 households in temporary accommodation. And yet there's 140 homes that have stood empty for 2 years or more, according to our council tax register. Next slide, please. Rationally, does it make any sense to keep your home empty? My answer is probably not. And so we have to look at why somebody would keep their home empty. Sometimes the home is, there's probate and there's arguments within the family, or it's not clear who the home is going to be, who's going to be the next owner. Sometimes they're too costly to repair and the owner just can't afford to get the property back into use. Negative equity can be a reason for that as well. Land banking isn't such an issue in Breckland. It may be in some areas in the future, but when I worked in central London, obviously land banking in the areas surrounding Liverpool Street Station, etc., was a big issue. Builders' investment, sometimes a builder will buy a wrecked property, and when his workforce have downtime, he will send them to do a little bit of work, and that way, you know, he's not paying for his labour costs for men to stand around idle, and they're working on the empty properties as and when. Storage, some people use them as storage. Sometimes it's just literally too much to cope with. You know, you've got an empty property on your hands, you've got your life to deal with, and it's too much to cope with. Same with illness. Memories, good and bad. Sometimes if it's mum or dad's house that you've inherited, you remember them in there, you've got fond memories, you don't want to sell that house and have other people living in it. The other end of the spectrum is if something bad happened in that house to you or somebody you love, you don't want to pass it on. There can be a psychological barrier which, you know, prevents a reasonable option to sell the property. And family dynamics with inherited properties, as anyone can imagine, you know, our families are sometimes our best friends and sometimes our worst enemies. Next slide. So in my mind, there's two different types of empty homes and different reasons for not wanting them empty. There's ones I've talked about that are a blight on the neighbourhood, the ones that you'd never want to live next door to, the ones you don't even want in your village, let alone anywhere near your house. The other type are ones that you would never know are empty. You'd drive past them, you could live next door to them for years, and actually they don't look bad, they don't have an impact on you, but actually these are the ones that could be useful for housing need in the future. Next slide, please. So what can we do? I've got here a shopping list of options available. And I've put them into simple order of carrots and sticks. So there's friendly persuasion. You know, private sector housing team, there's officers in my private sector housing team who've spent quite a few years trying to friendly persuade people to put their houses back into use. And a lot of time it works. You know, all sometimes people need is that little nudge. Grants or loans could be an option. Linking the owner with housing associations, estate agents and letting agents, just giving them that little extra help can help an owner who is sitting on an empty home actually make those moves. The sticks, these are for the ones where the carrots don't work. High council tax, I'll get onto all of these in a moment and explain what we're doing. Continued enforcement if there's nuisance, pests, dangerous structures, etc. Enforced sale, which is following other enforcement action, and I'll explain more about those later. Dangerous structures, demolition. Not always the option if you're a terrace. Boarding up, which again isn't often the option, because sometimes a boarded up property can encourage blight more than a property that isn't boarded up. But we do have the power as a council to board properties up. Compulsory purchase orders, which I'll explain later, and empty dwelling management orders. Again, I'll explain in depth about those later. Next slide. So council tax, currently we charge a full council tax plus the maximum premium for empty homes. And so this means if you've got an empty home that's over 10 years empty, you are now charged 400% of your council tax. So there is that is one of those sticks. If I owned an empty home and I was getting charged that amount on it, and it's not of any economic value to me, why would I keep it? Next slide. So another stick is continued enforcement. With the continued enforcement, there's a number of actions we can take depending on what the problem is, and these are arranged that different teams in the council can deal with. So we can deal with boarding up under the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act 82. There's various things we can do out under the Town and Country Planning Act, such as if it's detrimental to the amenity of the area, that kind of thing. So we can carry out enforcement. Also, most of these acts, we can do what's called work in default, which is if the owner doesn't respond to a legal notice, the council can do the work, but then put a charge on the property. So that is an option to us. And if you don't mind moving to the next slide, please. So what do we do when there's a debt on the property and nobody pays that debt? we have the option of enforced sale, even for a relatively small debt on a property, if nobody's paying it. And that can be a council tax debt as well. So if one of these empty homes that's being charged a lot of council tax and the owner isn't actually paying that council tax, they're just, you know, sweeping it under the carpet and forgetting about it, we can actually enforce sale on that property. So what we do is we attach a legal charge to the title, and if the owner doesn't repay the outstanding debt, we apply to the land registry to enforce the sale of the property according to the Law of Property Act 1925. So as 1925, this is an old piece of legislation, but it's a very effective one. Next slide, please. So with enforced sale, what do we need to do? So in the first place, there has to be a debt attached to the property. The problem with that is we might want to enforce sale because the house is a blight, but there might not be a debt. The owner might pay off all their debts to the council. There may be a very old debt on that property, but it hasn't been properly registered. Perhaps it was sort of pre-1990s when registering of debts became a lot easier with the new land registry reforms in the 1990s. Or we could go through all the motions of getting an enforced sale, and then at the last minute, the owner goes, "Yep, there's your money," and still that property is sitting there empty, a blight to the neighbours. So enforced sale is extremely good and extremely useful, but there are a few times when it just doesn't work. So in order for this to be a solution and to work, we need to make sure that all enforcement options for empty homes are considered, and that all debts are properly registered, and that when there is a debt, we consider enforced sale. Next slide. And because of that issue, because we need to work as a council rather than in individual teams looking at our different priorities, in January this year, the Empty Properties Steering Group was set up. And that's where teams across the council, we meet to look at the worst empty properties. We have a scoring matrix that identifies the worst properties. And for each problem empty property, we bring it to the meeting and we look at all the enforcement options. You know, what can we do as a council? Not what can we do as my team, what can we do as the environmental protection team, what can we all do? And then we work together, we monitor the progress, and where possible, we serve the notices. Where applicable, we make sure that any debts on that property are registered, and we establish whether we can do the enforced sale option. Because if so, it is a very quick and easy option that doesn't need that much resource to be able to enforce sale on those properties. And for an example, if there was a small council tax debt on a property, in the past, ARP have said it's actually not worth our time enforcing sale on a property for a £50 debt. But as a council, actually that property is a blight in our neighbourhoods, where, you know, all you as councillors are having everyone saying, what's the council doing about this property? If we look at it as a council-wide issue, and that's what we're doing now through the Empty Properties Steering Group, we can say to ARP, yes, it's not your issue to recoup that £50. It's a council issue to recoup that £50 because we can enforce sale. So looking at it as a council-wide issue rather than individual departments has really helped in this. And the group looks at empty properties, not just homes. Because for myself as private sector housing manager, I'm always asked about empty homes. Any legislation I can use is all about empty homes. Actually, there are a lot of properties that are blight on, you know, that maybe used to have been the local village shop or used to be the local takeaway, and they're not homes. So again, we look at it as a council-wide issue. What can we do about all these properties that are a blight? Next slide, please. Now, what happens when we can't enforce sale? And earlier on, I gave you a shopping list. And this is a shopping list. These are things that we could do and we can consider for our policy. One of these is compulsory purchase order. CPOs are not quick and easy. And there's a reason for that. The state is taking away someone's private property. And therefore, throughout history, we've put laws in place to make sure that that can't just be done on a whim. That has to be done for a reason, and it has to be done properly. And that's why, bureaucratically and time-wise and resource-wise, these are a long option. They're not something you can just dip in and out of. But they can be used for times when owners refuse to take action to bring a property back into use. An owner can't be traced. At the moment, we use genealogists, I can't pronounce it, but we use them to look for relatives, look for long lost, second cousins twice removed. Sometimes we can't trace an owner. A property's been empty for a long time, is causing nuisance and is a danger to the public, but the owner's refusing to do anything. And what happens after we've compulsory purchased? When we, if they've had a CPO, they're sold by a preferred purchaser or by auction, and then they're monitored to ensure that they're put back into use. And we can sell a house with an improvement notice on it, outlining the work required and a legal timescale. So we can actually legally say, buyer, beware, this is what we're going to ask you to do with the property. We're not going to ask you to just leave it empty as it has been for 25 years. But they're lengthy and time consuming. Next slide. This is all little writing, and it's little writing for a purpose. It's because it's so much, there's so much to get on one page. So first we have to have a council policy to say that we will use empty CPOs and why we will use them, and the house has to fit into that policy. So if we can have a policy that says long-term empty homes, we will consider compulsory purchase orders. Then we have to formulate a proposal. We have to make sure that we can show and can evidence that negotiations that we have carried out haven't worked. We've got to justify that we're not just, it's not just our first option. We've tried everything else. Then we've got to resolve that we will serve the order. And so that's where normally, depending on the policy, either senior managers or councillors make that decision to resolve it. We are going to go forward with the compulsory purchase order. Then we have to submit all our paperwork to the Secretary of State. And at that point, the Secretary of State will be asking for objections. So we will be asked to put out a public notice asking for objections and for those to go to the Secretary of State and give local people or anybody a chance to object. The Secretary of State then may ask for a public inquiry, which we will have to fund and manage. And then the Secretary of State will come to a decision, hopefully that the order is confirmed after all that work. And then there's possession. So there's all the legal stuff, you know, the conveyancing, what, you know, that you do when you buy a house, all of that has to go on. And then compensation. So the owner is then compensated for the loss. Now we can do that through selling the house at auction and then compensating the owner for the loss. And there's a very complicated formula, again, under the Land and Compensation Act 1925, and various statutory instruments that keep changing as to how we compensate the owner. Next slide, please. So what do we need? We need a policy if we want to do compulsory purchase orders for empty homes. Our policy will need to be evidence-based. For example, you know, if we're going to CPO through housing need, we need to evidence why we're going to CPO through housing need. formulation, this is a stage where we've decided we're going to CPO and we're getting all of our evidence together. This should include the fact that we've offered to buy the property from the owner at full market value. So if we're going to CPO and we're going to be doing all of these, we need to have a reserve amount of cash to be able to offer the owners this amount of money. And we also need to show that we've negotiated through a substantial period of time. And so with all these stages, from my professional experience, it's time consuming. And we can always, there's always the risk that the CPO is not going to go ahead due to objections or the whim of a Secretary of State at the time. So if we want to seriously consider CPO in our policy, we need to properly resource it, not dip in and out of it. And there needs to be, there is an element of economy of scale. If we do one CPO, it takes an officer a long time. If actually we're doing 4, 5, 6, 7 CPOs and the process is in place, it doesn't take as much time per CPO, if that makes sense. So if it's properly resourced, actually it's better to do lots than 1 or 2. Next slide, please. So I've just told you all the rigmarole involved in a compulsory purchase order, and I've explained it's there for a reason. You know, we're taking somebody's property away from them. It's something that we may or may have to do, but there's a lot involved. Now we come to another potential option to consider for our policy, which is empty dwelling management orders. They enable us as a council to take control and manage a residential property that's been empty for 2 years or more, where all of these provisions apply. So where all attempts to contact the owner and negotiate have failed, where it's been unoccupied for at least 2 years, where there's no prospect of the dwelling becoming occupied in the near future, where there's reasonable prospect that the dwelling will become occupied if we manage the property ourselves, and if we have complied with all of our duties seeking an HMO. So I'll go on to that in a second. Next slide. The procedure for this, again, we're temporarily taking someone's property away from them. So again, a complex procedure has been put in place, and I'm so sorry about the size of this. I thought on a big screen it may be readable, but it really isn't. I'm really sorry. But you do have the slides at home, hopefully, to refer to. I'll just go through the different parts of the procedure. The interim Edmode procedure is that if we've got all of our evidence that I've just told you that we need, if we've got all of that together, and we believe that we will be able to manage this property, and we want to manage this property in the future, we seek approval from a residential property tribunal for an interim Edmode. And so we go to the tribunal. Normally the tribunal is quite a long process. It's normally a whole day. But before that, several months before, they'll have asked us to submit our evidence. And if they have any questions, normally they come back to us in the 3 months before the tribunal sits. And then you stand in front of the tribunal. I've done this several times. Most of the tribunal's sittings will take a whole day. There will be usually 2 judges and a surveyor on the board, and they will make their decision. And if an interim Edmode is granted, then we seek control of the property. But at the time of an interim Edmode, we can't put a tenant in the property without the owner's permission. And at this stage, an owner can still refuse to cooperate. And if so, we need to apply for a final Edmode. Interim Edmode will be for 1 year. A final Edmode can be up to 7 years. So we've had this property for a year. Hopefully, with the owner's permission, we've put a tenant in. We can we keep the rent, and then we use the rent for all of our expenses for that property. And then it's only if any rent is left over, any money is left over after our expenses, that we pay the owner any of the money left over. So basically we're landlords. We're doing all the repairs, but we're also collecting the rent, and that can include housing benefits. The final Edmode, it doesn't require approval from the Residential Property Tribunal, but the owner, when we've applied for final Edmode, can appeal and take us back to the tribunal. Once in force, it lasts as a fixed period of no more than 7 years. However, the period, if there are costs still outstanding, or it believes that the property will not remain occupied if returned to the owner, then I've got myself in a little bit of a muddle here, but if after the final Edmode, if it can't be if it can't be put back into use, and we don't think that the owner will, we can still apply to the Residential Property Tribunal for a further one. That's what I meant by that, sorry. We don't need to, if it's a final Edmode, we don't need the consent of the owner to get occupation rights. So we can put people in there as tenants and run the property as if we are the landlord. So what happens, I've just explained, is that all properties with a final Edmode, they must be brought up to the Decent Homes Standard to be tenanted. We collect the rent, we use the costs, bringing the property back into use, and management costs, and any surplus is paid to the owner. So we need to account for all income and expenditure while we're running these properties, as any business does. Next slide. So if we want to do Edmodes in Breckland, we did a scoping exercise to see how many properties, how many of our long-term 2-year or more empties were suitable. And we found at least 20. Most of these have 3 bedrooms, gardens, and are near schools and shops. So they would be lovely homes for people that have no home at the moment. And we could run and manage the properties ourselves, so we could use a private manager, a charity, or a housing association. On the other side, Edmodes are resource intensive, and so we would need to put the resource in to actually getting the Edmode and running the Edmode. So we'd need to deploy an officer to do this work. And the risks are that the Residential Property Tribunal refuses the interim Edmode, or that the owner appeals later on and gets the property back via the tribunal. And that could be after we've spent money renovating the property, but haven't yet got the tenant in there. The owner can appeal, and if the tribunal says, yes, take it back, they can take it back from us. So then we've lost the money, but not had time to get the income back. Next slide. Another option for the policy is grants or loans, and we can consider giving these to owners. And we can place conditions on a grant or loan. And an example of that would be that once repairs are carried out, the owner has to lease the property to the council or a nominated charity or housing association. And then we use the property to house people on our housing register. The risks here are that we risk a loan not being paid back, but like any money lender, we would put a charge on the property and be able to enforce sale if that was the case. And we can risk spiralling costs if we're renovating a derelict property. You know, we've all seen the grand designs where somebody buys something and tries to get it back into use and the costs spiral. And we've just heard from UKPN, one of those could be power. You know, there's quite a few costs that can spiral when you're renovating a derelict property. So we need a good project manager and a good surveyor involved at that point in time. We need the cooperation of the owner. You know, we can't just give an owner a grant or loan if they don't want one. And we may need to project manage on behalf of the owner. A lot of these owners are owners of these derelict empty properties because they, they can't do it. Therefore, if we just give them the money to do it, they still won't get it done. So we may need to project manage on their behalf. Next slide. So it's all about finding the best fit depending on the property. And that depends on the condition of the property. It depends on our reason for getting the property back into use. Are we getting it back into use because of blight, or are we getting it back into use due to housing need? So for options like enforced sale, we look at have we got debts on the property? If not, can we get some registered? For options like grants or loans or on Edmode, what's the housing need? Normally a family who is on our housing register would need to be near to shops because they may not be able to afford to run a car, near to schools, near to bus stops, transport, to workplaces. Is a property easily repaired? We're not going to spend a fortune on getting a property back into use that we can't recoup the money back in rent later on. And is the owner willing? If the owner's willing, then grants or loans may be an option, whereas if they're not, then an Edmode may be. For CPO, have we a policy? Do we have a reason to CPO? And do we have the budget and resource? So for each empty property, there is a best fit, but that best fit is unique to that property. It's not one solution fits everything. Next slide. So the resources. My private sector housing team for many years have been using the negotiation route to get properties back into use and light touch enforcement. We're looking at doing more than what we're doing at the moment. We've got the empty property steering group now, which is focusing more council wide rather than a little team trying their little ways. We're looking at it holistically. However, that's limited to enforcement and enforced sale. So if we want long-term strategic empty homes work, what will we need to do? We'll need a policy. We'll need sustained commitment that we're not just dipping in and out of some of these measures, because as I've explained before, things like CPOs and Edmodes, you can't just dip in and out, and there is an economy of scale. If you're going to do it wholesale. Don't do it one or two here and there, because that doesn't actually help us financially. We put loads of resources in, but don't get much back. We need evidence. So we need evidence of an evidence-based policy that CPOs and Edmodes are going to work in these situations. And if this work is to be carried out, looking at teams that I've managed before that have done CPOs and Edmodes, and looking at other councils that are still doing them at the moment, one full-time officer and one part-time admin assistant is really required, and that's a resource for long-term strategic CPO and Edmo work. Next slide. I thought we could look at some case studies. These are anonymous. I've had to anonymise them due to GDPR. You can see from the pictures here, pigeons living in this house. It's a large pigeon coop, but it's also a terrace house. There's houses either side of it. Next slide, please. So this case study that you've just seen the photos for is a derelict house in a market town centre. Been empty for over 8 years, probably a lot longer than that. Very poor condition with pigeons living inside the house. It's not registered on land registry. It was thought to have been owned by person X, and person X didn't engage with the officers in my team or any attempts of any help. And neighbours offered to buy the property from person X with cash, and they were refused. And then person X died in early 2022. Genealogists are trying to establish ownership. Did person X actually own that house, or is it just rumour? And they're unsuccessful. So what do we do in a case like this? Next slide, please. What action can we take? So persuasion and guidance, well, we've tried it. The person that may or may not have been the owner is now dead. It's not working. Enforcement. This particular property was taken to the empty property steering group, and we're looking now at different enforcement options. Planning enforcement. Is it detrimental to the amenity of the area? If so, our planning department can serve a section 215 on the property, do work in default, put a charge on the property. We can look at enforced sale. Building control enforcement, to ask our building control officers, is it ruinous and dilapidated under Building Act 84? Is it a dangerous structure under the same act? If so, again, they could serve notice on the property. We could then do work in default. We could then put a charge on the property. We could then enforce sale. So there are options available without looking at Edmode or CPO. Grant or loan. Actually, this isn't suitable for this property. We don't know who owns it. Who are we going to give the grant or loan to if we don't know who owns it? Edmode, is this really a property that we're going to be able to do up and recoup all the money via rents? You know, an estimate is a guesstimate on how much it will cost to do up that property to a decent home standard and rent it out. So Edmode isn't an option. CPO, compulsory purchase. If all else fails, that will be our only option. So we can look at enforcement and enforce sale. If they fail, then CPO will be our only option. But at the moment, we haven't got that in our policy. So that's why, obviously, I'm speaking to yourselves about this.
Sorry, so
yeah,
how would you do any of those without establishing the ownership and presumably not having the deeds to the property?
With enforced sale, you can still do that. You can,
so you'd register at the land registry first?
We register it, yeah. So it is still, and we can still serve notice and do works in default without knowing the ownership. It's not as nice because we have to actually attach the notice in a prominent position onto the property, and obviously that attracts attention. But you can still serve the notice and do the work in default without actually knowing who owns the property. So long as you can show that you've looked into it and that there is no owner that we can find. So the possible options I've put here in the bluey grey colour, the ones that aren't options in this circumstance, I've put in the sort of beigey yellow. Next slide, please. Case study 2, a terrace house in a village. This is a terraced house where, as you can see, there's a complicated roof structure that is intertwined with the house next door. The house next door, a lovely little cottage. You know, people have taken care to look after their home. But actually, the condition of the roof of the empty house is causing a problem. Next slide, please. So what action can we take when there's this higgledy-piggledy arrangement and actually there's water coming into next door from the arrangement of this roof? Persuasion and guidance. We know the owner. We've tried to persuade her. We've tried to guide her. We've been doing this, again, for about 8 years. It's not working. Enforcement. We've already carried out enforcement and we've already served a notice on the property to get the roof sorted out to stop the water ingress into next door. So there are enforcement and council tax debts on the property. and therefore enforced sale is our option. Grant or loan, that could be an option, but we'd need to project manage. The particular owner of this property, she's not going to be capable of project managing. Empty dwelling management orders, actually on this property, using the rent to cover repairs, we're never going to recoup our money, so that's not the option. Compulsory purchase, if all else fails, this could be an option on this property. So that's these case studies to give you a flavour of that it's horses for courses. You know, different options can suit different properties for different reasons. Next slide. So looking at Breckland empty homes policy, at the moment we don't have an empty homes policy, and obviously as Gordon explained earlier, there's a wider housing issue and a wider housing policies that are going to be looked at and come through. But we're soon going to be drafting our empty homes policy. So before we do so, we need direction on a number of questions. You know, myself as a council officer, I'm not here to make these decisions on what direction we go. I'm here, once the directions are there, to write the policy and then for my teams to carry out the work. So do we just want to concentrate on those empty homes that are a blight on the neighbourhood? Or do we want to address housing need with our empty homes policy? Are members broadly supportive for the council to use enforced sale when their debts occurred secured on an empty home? Do members want the policy to include compulsory purchase orders? If so, obviously, as I explained before, it's a long-running process, and so it will need to be resourced, somebody to do that. Do members want the policy to include empty dwelling management orders? And if so, again, it's, as I've said quite a few times, it's an economy of scale. To do one empty dwelling management order, 10, 20, actually doesn't take that much more resource. But it's not something you dip in and out of. It's not something you say, let's do one, let's do another 10 years time. It doesn't work that way in my professional experience. Do members want owners to be given grants or loans to improve their empty homes? And if so, what will the conditions be? Will we as a council be managing the properties once they're repaired? I've left you with questions, not answers, sorry. But hopefully I've covered things.
Okay, thank you very much. Gordon, very briefly you, then I'm going to go very briefly to a couple of members, and then I'm going to structure. If you could leave that last slide up, please, Ruth. We'll go through those questions as a committee and make some directions from scrutiny to the cabinet member.
Well, very briefly, I was just going to say I have looked at these set of slides over the last couple of weeks, and I am aware of lots of the situations behind them. And I think it's right that we should come to you to questions. I don't have answers yet. I want to hear what your answers are.
Very good. If I could start us off with just one quick question, which is, what is the total number of empty homes that we've identified presently? And what is the total number of empty homes of that against which we've taken some form of enforcement action?
There's 140 that council tax have identified to us that are long-term empty. So those are homes that have been empty for the 2 years or more, and therefore are racking up those large council tax increases. The ones with enforcement action, this is something I'm trying to find out at the moment, actually, is because a lot of them have had enforcement action in the past, and it's in an officer's memory somewhere. So different teams have got changeover of staff. Some people can't remember. So it's actually looking at all those individual properties and finding out, is there a debt secured on that property? The empty properties steering group at the moment, we're concentrating on the top 8.
Okay.
The worst 8 that are most blight, and they're the ones that we're looking at.
And the steering group is officers only?
At the moment, yes.
Okay, Understood. So I've got, and could I encourage members to be very brief, because I want us to go through those questions and make recommendations to the cabinet member who can take them away and consider them. Roger first, then Peter, then Harry, then Linda, but brief comments or questions only, because I'm conscious of time and I'm conscious we have actually quite a few questions to go through substantively.
I'll try, Chairman, but I do feel like I've got some important points to make on this, and we are being asked for our considered opinion on the options.
And we will be going through those line by line.
We will, but there's some points I need to raise in
Okay,
relation
we'll spend
to
less
those.
time talking to me and more time making the points.
Right, empty homes. So the first thing I want to say is in relation to perhaps elderly people who have had to move into residential care, and they may be have dementia, and family members, there is no power of attorney in place. So the family can't act because there isn't a power of attorney. The family could apply to the court, but that can take up to 12 months for them to get a court order and longer to be able to act. So I think in terms of those homes, I think that is a minefield if you're going to try and take those homes away from those people. And invariably what will happen with those homes, there's an asset there that may be long-term. The county council may be paying for care. The county council will want to recoup those costs on any sale of the properties in the future. So I think that is very problematic, and I don't know what percentage of those type of properties make up your 100 and something properties you were talking about. And I do think there's some work there. Probably there needs to be a wider piece of work done, encouraging people to get powers of attorney in place, health power of attorney, and financial powers of attorney. I think that's something that needs to be advertised. People do need to be encouraged to get that in place, but there is a cost for doing that. In terms of the second legal charge and enforced sale, are we able to, if there's a property there that owes the council money through unpaid council tax, without going down the compulsory purchase and forced sale route, can we not just put a legal charge on the property? It may take a while before that property eventually goes on the market for sale, but could we not just put the legal charge on there without having to have all the expenditure of then trying to compulsory purchase or enforce sale, which may or may not go through if we put the legal charge on? Do you want to answer that first, and then I'll come back?
Yeah, so yeah, ARP already do that. And so, yeah, that they already put charges on properties. It's just sometimes it's not worth their while going through the rest of the route because the money isn't that much. Whereas for us, if it's a blight on the property and it's a council priority, then it may be worth it.
And my last point, Chairman, is second homes. So lots of empty properties, I'm guessing. Have we got any idea of the numbers of properties that are empty, generally empty, which are second homes? Because from what I can see, that they are a problem because they generally sit there empty for a majority of the year. We can't seem to do anything about that, and we're not doing anything about increasing council tax for those properties, which would bring in revenue for the council. Is that a particular problem, and are we looking to try and address that as a council?
I don't know if that's a problem. I know North Norfolk have just done an exercise to see how much of a problem it is there. And where I live in North Norfolk, I'm the only person who lives in a house in my street. 6 houses, I'm the only person. Yeah, it's nice, it's quiet. So I understand that. Second homes, I'm not sure how ARP are dealing with those at the moment, because there is also an issue that some people will register their empty home as a second home to get out of that extra charge that we can put on an empty home. So that is something we need to speak to ARP about and look at their enforcement and whether they're checking on second homes.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you for that presentation. Brilliant. The 100, are you only dealing with these privately empty homes, or is any of that number 140 social housing? And if you're dealing with that, or is another team dealing with that? Because I think one of your questions here that needs to address housing need as well.
I'm not actually sure, I'm afraid. We haven't got that far with our empty homes work to look into how many are social housing. Obviously, the spreadsheet I get from ARP, I can easily look and see how many of those are social housing and get back to you on that figure.
It's very important, and Jill knows that I have identified empty flagship Victory housing houses in my patch and neighbouring patches as well. When we had a fire to house a lady, we had 3 in my village I didn't know of, and Jill knows I had people waiting for houses, but obviously the house association hadn't informed our housing team. So I think that needs to be grabbed rather than wait for them. Go to them, say, you know, check out what's empty and what's and why, to bring them back onto the list. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I appreciate you know, the complexity of it. Peter's partly taken what I was going to ask. There's obviously a read across there, which I suggest with other parts of the housing team in relation to the housing association providers, because whilst they may not have something empty for 2 years, there's sometimes quite a long period between occupancy, etc. So there's a read across there in terms of the housing need. I was also going to ask about the 140, about whether that did or didn't include those providers, which Peter's already asked. The other brief question I've got, and I probably will be writing to Gordon after the meeting, a few points, is does the steering group include looking, or will it include looking at things like retail premises, etc. And Gordon, but also Mr. James will know where I'm going with this, because many years ago, about 5 years ago, Breckland had a scheme called Unsightly Sites, which Councillor asked to report. That did include not just domestic properties, but others. So I do know how complex it is, and I think some of the issues around blight, etc., applies to non-domestic properties as well. Also, some of the carrots aren't there, but some of the sticks are. There used to be carrots for listed properties where you could get, you know, VAT, etc. It wouldn't be applied and so forth, or grants back, and that's been discontinued. So that's a national thing. But I will be writing and discussing with Gordon outside the meeting, because there is a landmark property that's been empty in my ward now for 5 years, a subject of considerable public interest and disquiet, which I've kept quiet about the last year or two and sort of given up on. Members will know which one I'm referring to, right near the Deer and War Memorial. Thank you.
Whilst I am happy to answer that and will respond to the letter, I should say I am not on the steering group. It is an office group that's looking at things technically.
Yeah, the steering group does look at empty properties as well as empty homes. Obviously, as private sector housing manager, in the past, it's been a little bit segmented, whereas now together. And I think Steve probably knows the property you're talking about.
Thank you, Chairman. I've just been through this process with one of your officers on behalf of an adjoining ward to mine, and it took 2 years, but we got there. My gut feeling is, of course, we should bring back empty homes into use because we've got a massive housing waiting list. But my advice, my recommendation to the other members would be to ask Gordon as cabinet member to take it back, because we need some more work done on this. We need some costings against it. You know, you've talked about a full-time officer and a part-time officer, which I think is vital, but we need some costings against it, and to weigh the whole thing up, and just to actually support Peter and Harry on the housing association. So we've got one in my village that's been rented out by a housing association. chap doesn't live there, but because he's paying his rent, they won't do anything about it. And yet we've got families who need to be housed. So there needs to be some more meat on the bones, I think. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Which brings us on to our 5 points that you've asked us to consider. I am sympathetic to Linda's statement, which is I think Scrutiny would benefit from a bit of a build out around the policy implications of each of those 5, the cost implications. It sounds like we're currently not 100% coordinated across the council in terms of the different powers available to us and how they're utilised and where they've been utilised and what properties are at risk. If members will indulge me to make a proposal, which would be that we request the cabinet member to take this away and work up those implications financial and policy wise and bring it back to this committee for us to give some input on. Roger, before I let you come back, I'll let you speak on the proposal, but I'll look for a seconder for my proposal first. I've got Vera. All those who would like to speak on the proposal, please indicate. Roger.
Generally supportive of the proposal, but for me, there's just 2 main thrusts to this that I think the officers do need to flesh out. One is, we need the costings in relation to trying to bring all empty homes back into use for people to live in. Is that the aim? Or what would the costings be if we're simply looking at a policy that's going to bring dilapidated homes back in, or unsightly dilapidated homes back into use? I think the 2 things are different, and I'd like to know what the cost difference to the council would be for to give one or the other, because it might be actually the amount of empty houses that are there that we could realistically bring back into use on a risk basis of whether the courts, etc., would allow it. The cost might be prohibitive. We might think, well, there'll be a better way of getting housing, some additional housing in place for those people. To me, that's the 2 thrusts of what we need to know, but generally supportive of the
I agree. I actually see it as 3 thrusts because you have dilapidated residential properties, empty residential properties, and then, as Harry's mentioned, you have dilapidated commercial properties, and the council has powers across all of those. And I was the housing portfolio holder in North Norfolk back in the day, and we did have a group that looked to coordinate all of the powers available to us, and there are a large number, to try and get the best outcomes for each property rather than siloing them according to those thrusts. So is that clear enough for you, Gordon, if the committee does determine to support this proposal?
Yes, it is clear. I've got 2 tasks. One includes, I'd written 3 groups as well.
Excellent. All right. In which case, all those in favour of that proposal, then please indicate. Thank you. That is passed unanimously. And I thank you for your presentation. We look forward to the next one, where we get to take apart some of the meat and bones of the policy proposals and financial implications. And we will move on to the next item, which is item 9, task and finish groups. I understand we've got the report coming in October. Linda, do you have any update you want to make?
No, it is that.
Brilliant, thank you. Item 10, outside body feedback. Does anyone have any outside body feedback they want to bring to the committee's attention? Not at this time, seeing none. Thank you very much. Item 11, scrutiny call-ins. There are none for this meeting, but I understand that we're getting information in respect of Mike Nairn's suggestion, and we should have more information ahead of the meeting next month. We're liaising with environmental services in this council, and we've already contacted Norfolk County Council. It appears that there may be powers across both councils that need to be considered by the committee. Are there any other points that members would like to make on councillor call-in? Seeing none. Oh, I should mention, oh, actually, it's on the next item. Forget that. That I, in fact, belay all of what I just said there. That was completely the wrong item to say that under councillor call-in is in relation to cabinet decisions only. There are no councillor call-ins. Councillor call for actions, please reinstate what I just said about Mike Nairn. Roger, if you want to speak on that, and then I'll just finish my last point.
Just, I have an item that I'd like this committee to call in, if that's possible.
Call in.
Oh, well, not calling, sorry.
Is this
My
call for-
my call for action, that I would like representative bodies to come here and speak to this committee
Okay.
and answer questions. So, and I had previously discussed this with the chairman of the council, or part of it. So it's to do with, I think it would be really useful if we got primary care providers in here, representatives from primary care providers, and the dentist service in Norfolk, particularly Breckland, and to come in and give us an overview of where their service currently is at, because there's
Or is anywhere.
or is anywhere. There's lots of consternation about problems getting hold of a dentist, NHS dentist, or getting an appointment with your GP. So I think it would be good to understand the level of the problems that they are facing, and what we as a council and the general public could do to try and help them. And also, I think it would be very useful if we could have some kind of presentation from the ambulance service, because there is a definite problem at the moment with the ambulance service, and reaction times to 999 calls, etc., and then the queuing outside the hospital. I think it would be, there's a lot made in the press about it, but I think it would be good to have an expert come in here and explain to us exactly what the problem is that they are facing at the moment. And again, is there anything that can be done to assist them? So I would like those people to come in, please.
So one of those points was actually raised at the last meeting by Mike, which was in relation to dentistry, and we discussed that. And I think you're right, we absolutely, and I think Ruth started making some initial inquiries around that. The PCT, I think, is a different, and I've been trying to, because they just closed the Attleborough dentist for NHS patients, at least. I was trying to work out exactly where the procurement goes. I think procurement for dentistry is at the East of England level. And then we've obviously got the Norfolk and Suffolk Primary Care Trust as well. So it may well be we need two different meetings to speak to two different organisations, one for dentistry, one for healthcare generally. And of course, you'll know that IALGA, I think that's the shortening of East of England Ambulance Services, they are another organisation. It's beautifully joined up, rather like our power networks. So yes, we can look to add all of those. In fact, if you wait until item 13, we'll pop them on the work programme. And the only other thing I was going to mention under this item erroneously before was that I did get an email from the Environment Agency in respect of Bannon Poultry. You may recall we brought that as an item. So the ownership has changed again. Enforcement action did proceed, and I'm hoping that we will bring them back to provide an update either towards the end of this year or early next year, so they can say, you know, what the outcomes were from that, what the improvements hopefully that are happening are, so that we can close that one off. I'll go to Linda first, and I'll come back to you, Roger, and I'll go to Peter.
Thank you, Chairman. I have some reservations about where we're dealing with medical matters and health service. And Steve might be able to back me up here. Some time ago, we called in the practice manager of Watton when residents were all being displaced everywhere else. And we were able to do that as a council, although we don't have any influence over medical things, because it affected the residents. So with the dentistry and the doctors and the ambulance, which I get, would it be more appropriate, can I ask Steve, to get someone from the CCG in? Because they're the funders, aren't they?
Yes, if you are familiar with the commissioning for the different services.
Yeah, it's not straightforward, as I think we've identified. With your permission, Chairman, I'll take away an action to speak with my counterparts within the clinical commissioning group to establish the best people in order to meet the request of Councillor Attwell's proposal, and then check in with yourself to ensure that you're comfortable with.
That would be great. And I think it is three separate issues. It's dentistry, it's primary care, and then it's also ambulance response time. So it may be you need more than one person to fix all of those. No, 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 absolutely. We need to get the right person in front of us. So, Peter.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's 3 separate call-ins, if you like. When I was on the Norfolk Health Overview Scrutiny Commission in Norwich, we did do that on separate occasions. The ambulance service, I did go on a 12-hour shift with those guys and then an 8-hour shift to the control room and found out firsthand, you know, the issues and problems they have. And the big thing they have, and it's still out there, is the duty of care. That is why we get a list of ambulances queuing up with people who definitely don't need to be there, because we need the interactive care system linked together. And that's another subject, of course, but you know what I mean? There should be a doctor, a nurse, or somebody where that patient can go to without being taken away by the ambulance service at 7 o'clock in the morning because they fell over, blood pressure's gone up, and they don't want to leave. That is the issue, and the ambulance take them away. And then they could be treated in the home with another part of the system.
Thank you, Peter. And Roy.
Just as a side or whatever, we have members here who are on the Norfolk Health Scrutiny Board, who are not here today because you have to be on ONS Breckland to be on there, and they've put the 2 meetings on the same day. So if we're going to have these people come, we have people with a lot more expertise because they've been dealing with it. Can we just ask somebody to have a look at meeting dates and stop this business of meeting on the same day, especially for similar type organisations? It just seems another little bit.
No, it's a fair point. It is the first time I'm aware that it's happened, but I'm sure Councillor Kybird is relaying his displeasure at missing our meeting today. Great. Roger, did you want to just say your final point, and then I'm going to move to the work programme? Great. So item 13 is the work programme. To go on to it, I know in October we need to look at a referral from council that occurred last week in relation to fuel poverty. So are you able to add that one, Ruth? No, don't worry. I thought you might not have been with me. So there was a referral from full council on fuel poverty, which I think we need to look at next month. Then if we could add in on future items, those 3 points with a note that Steve is going to take those away and identify the appropriate persons to contact. If you could also add Banham Poultry as an item that we should chase up to get an update from the Environment Agency. And then obviously we've already got the one in respect of Mike Nairn's suggestion around vergers. And then lastly, I wanted to add an item, if the committee will indulge me, in respect of the fire service. You may be aware that there was a report done by the inspectorate in respect of the fire service, and it was once again flagged as improvement needed, which is obviously a very disappointing report, notwithstanding the happy preface that the cabinet report at Norfolk County Council gave it. So I think it would be helpful for us to bring in a representative to talk to us about why they are where they are and what they're going to be doing to improve that. I understand the inspectorate will be returning to do a further inspection on an urgent basis at the beginning of next year. So it obviously isn't in a good state. Are there any other items on the work programme that people either would like removed or added? Or any other comments? Linda.
Thank you, Chairman. I know I'm bringing the report next month from the Task and Finish group, but we did agree with the people we work with that we'd also look at it again in 6 months to see if they've implemented some of the recommendations, and that would be useful to do that before next year's local election.
Okay, so you're hoping April?
April, yeah.
Yeah. Are you able
just about
to?
be the 6 months, wouldn't
I can't remember what the dates. I know there's one in March. I'm not sure we've actually scheduled. Yeah, that wouldn't prevent us from carrying out that item. If Ruth, you could pop it on the latest meeting that we have before May. Yeah, that's great. Any other comments, questions, points? No, excellent. Thank you very much. Then that's the new work programme. Lots to do, especially in relation to health and fire. So date of next meeting is 20th of October. Look forward to seeing you all then. And thank you very much.